Hey, yes. Welcome everyone. I'm again replacing Bert this time. It's sort of a regular thing now, almost. No. And also welcome everyone on Zoom. Today we have Dominique Wirz from University of Fribourg, and you're visiting researcher now at ASCOR, so you will stay here till Christmas. And yeah, we're very looking forward to your talk. And for everyone online, you can, if you have a question, you can put it in the Q&A box. And then Gijs will read them out loud. And there, if you have a question, just wait at Gijs. Yeah. Okay, I'll give you the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thanks for having me today. I'm presenting a project that I do together with my colleague Sina Blasnik from the University of Zurich. And it's very much work in progress. So I'm happy to hear all your thoughts and comments about it. Here's also a picture of Sina. So that you can see her, and I think I might diminish this one, so yeah, that you can see the slide. And this project is actually based on a call that the Swiss Federal Office of Communication launched in spring this year, and they were interested in projects investigating governance models related to hate speech. And what we do is actually not related to governance models, but we said in order to assess how regulation or co-regulation or self-regulation of hate speech can work, we also need to know what the public perceives as hate speech, and not only what the law or we as academics understand from this term. And so the project is actually about investigating how much the academic or legal definition of hate speech overlaps with public perceptions of hate speech. Okay, so let's probably start with these definitional aspects of hate speech. From a scientific perspective, we can say that hate speech are statements that have specific targets. It can be an individual person, but often it's groups. For example, based on religion, sexual orientation, gender, appearance, and so on. And hate speech are statements that are to incite violence or hate, or also that attack or diminish the target. And what is interesting is that humor has a specific role in hate speech. Often statements that are humorous but correspond to these two definitional criteria are not considered as hate speech. So that makes it particularly difficult when we think of automatic detection of hate speech, because as soon as something is humor, it is also by the law not considered as hate speech. Now, if we apply a more legal perspective, the Council of Europe has actually issued some guidelines in May, and they state that there are more and less severe forms of hate speech. Very severe forms of hate speech actually fall under criminal law, so they have to be prosecuted. Then there is less severe cases, but they may still fall under civil or administrative law. And then the Council of Europe also states that there are some offensive expressions which are not legally restricted, but still call for a response from society. So they say that even if not all of the hate speech statements are actually can actually be legally prosecuted, the society should still do something, for example, engage in counter speech or whatever. And here I have provided a small list of legally relevant forms of hate speech. For example, insult, defamation or slander. Slander means to tell lies about someone, or public incitement to crime, coercion, or threat. So these are also the dimensions that we want to look at in our studies. Now, when we look at what has been investigated about public perceptions of hate speech, we see that in Europe, and this is data from Germany, but it looks a bit similar across Europe, about 40% of the general population report being confronted with hate speech on the internet often or very often, whatever that exactly means. I will come back to this later. If we look at a potentially vulnerable group, namely young adults, a majority of them report being a victim of hate speech during the last 3 months. So this is, according to my perception, quite a lot. We can see here there are different numbers for different countries. In France, it's 54%. In Spain, Poland, UK, it's about 65%, and in the US, it's even 73%. The lowest value in this study was found in Finland with only 43%, but it's still quite a lot if we think about that this was in the last 3 months, and they were victims of hate speech, so not only exposed to it, but actually targeted by it. Now, what is also notable is that the exposure to hate speech has been rising in the past years. And I found this particularly notable because the platforms and media companies actually engage in efforts to monitor and moderate hate speech. And they did so increasingly in the last years. But at some point, this seems not to be very fruitful. Or the question now is, what do actually people see and consider it to be hate speech? And is this potentially something that is not targeted by those interventions? And this is where actually our project wants to kick in. So first of all, we are interested in how often people exactly are exposed to hate speech. Because when they say often or very often, what does it mean? Is that every day? Is that every month? Or what do they think? And then also, what do they consider to be hate speech? Does it correspond to these definitions that we as academics use or that the law uses? Or is it maybe something else? And as I said in the opening, we think that in order to optimize automated approaches, but also regulations towards hate speech, it's important to know these potential gaps between public perception of hate speech and academic or legal definition. So that's why we also call the project Exposure to Factual and Subjective Hate Speech, because the factual is more what the law defines, or maybe also what academic definitions say, and perceived is what the public sees as hate speech. Now, why do we think that there might be such gaps in the perception or between the factual and the subjective perception? We do think so because our perceptions are generally biased. So we as humans are not very good in making objective observations. We know a lot of biases, and I think most of you might be familiar with these. For example, the false consensus effect, which states that we tend to assume everyone or many people share our opinions. The confirmation bias, which lets us recall expected information more easily than unexpected information. Then positive negative asymmetry, which says that in some moments we pay more attention to positive information and in others more to negative information. Or the third person effect, which states that we assume that persuasive, especially negative persuasive effects are stronger for others than for ourselves. And all of these biases that I just briefly explained now might contribute to the so-called hostile media phenomenon, which has been established mainly in reference to media reports, but which can, I think, be transferred to also other forms of communication. And a hostile media effect describes a perception of actually neutral media reporting as biased towards the own group, or as more favorable towards an out group. And there are actually three mechanisms that can explain why this happens. The first one is selective recall of media content, which is actually a form of the confirmation bias. When you belong to a specific group, and especially when it's a minority group, you are probably used to not being treated favorably by society. And so this is your expectation. And when you read a media content where your group is being mentioned, you expect it not to be favorable, and that's why you recall information that goes in this direction better than the rest of the media content. The second mechanism is selective categorization. And that means that when you have a very strong opinion or an extreme attitude on an issue, you will not only find the counter position as is not acceptable, but even a moderate view on this topic or a moderate perception or a position is not acceptable for you. So when a media report, for example, proposes moderate views, you are going to perceive them as hostile towards you and not as moderate. And the third mechanism is different standards. That means that when you have this extreme attitude or a very strong identification with one side, You will think that some arguments are valid and others are not so valid in a debate, and you will probably perceive that media reporting always uses the arguments that are more favorably to the other side and not the arguments that you consider important. So all of these mechanisms then add up so that people who have a very strong identification with a certain group or a very strong position on some issue or topic perceive media reporting that is actually quite balanced to be biased towards the other side. And now we think that this can also translate to the perception of hate speech, or to the perception, actually, to be more precise, of offensive statements about groups, and to our perception of if this is hate speech or not. And when we look at potentially negative statements about groups, there are different factors that can influence if we find the statement just negative or maybe a bit offensive, or if we say, no, this is hate speech and this should be punished. One thing can be the target, and I think here most important is how much we identify with this group. But another aspect that could also be relevant is if we think this is a vulnerable group, or if we think this is a quite well-established group and probably it's not so much of an issue. Then, of course, it might depend on the attributes that are used. And here we can also think of stereotypical attitudes, for example, that we are used to. We might find them less problematic because we think, maybe it's a bit true. And other attributes are probably more problematic, or also perceived as more problematic by a larger part of the population. And it can also depend on the sender, if we like the person or not, and it can also depend on the context. For example, if we think this is a very broad audience that can see these statements and it has a potentially high impact on the opinion of others, or if we think not many people can see it, or also is it in a conflict where the other side has also made not so nice statements, or however we judge the context. But in general, we would say that when individuals belong or identify with a group, they are more likely to perceive statements as hostile. And to our knowledge, there are two studies that have investigated this. One is actually in line with our expectations. This is the study by Popkunova and colleagues from 2020. They find that social distance towards migrants predicts the perception of statements about migrants as hate speech or not. So people who closely identified or have a low social distance towards migrants were more likely to perceive statements as hate speech than those with a high social distance to migrants. Then on the other hand, a study by Boyatsky and colleagues from 2018 found no difference in men and women in judging statements about women as hate speech. Now, this study has been a bit methodologically different, I would say, because people had to classify a very large number of statements. And these statements range from being quite nice and into being really, really offensive. And I think if you have the choice of such a large number of statements and have to classify each one, then probably men and women, of course, are likely to say, yeah, this is a quite nice statement, and no, this is a very bad statement, and probably there's not so much of a difference than when you are just seeing one statement and probably out of context. But also the study might point out the fact that not all target groups are vulnerable in the same way. So it might be that it really needs to be a minority group, like a physical minority group. I mean, women are maybe disadvantaged in some contexts, but they're not a minority. So it might also point to the importance of the target group that is actually mentioned. Now, when we perceive media reporting as hostile, it is quite well documented that this elicits anger. And anger usually goes along with a desire for punishment. This is according to the emotions appraisal tendency. So appraisal theory basically says that when something negative happens to you and you find someone who is responsible for this event, you're going to be angry. And if no one is responsible, you will more likely be sad than angry about this negative event. And now if someone is responsible and it is negative for you, then you want this person or actor to be punished. And also in the context of political measures, studies have shown that anger fosters a preference for punitive measures over other kind of political measures. So we assume that when individuals perceive a statement as very hostile or as hate speech, they will also agree that the sender or the author of this statement should be punished. So overall, we have formulated 3 research questions and 2 hypotheses for this larger project. The research questions are more in a descriptive sense, so we are interested in what types of statements Swiss citizens consider as hate speech, how often and where they encounter such statements on the internet, and how this does the individual perception of hate speech differ from academic definitions of hate speech. The hypotheses are actually related to the things I just explained about the hostile media phenomenon. Hypothesis 1 states that when individuals belong to the target group of an offensive statement, they are more likely to perceive the statement as hate speech. And hypothesis 2 is that when individuals belong to the target group, they are more supportive of punitive measures against the sender of the statement. Now, what we want to do is we want to do 2 different studies. One is a representative survey of the Swiss population, or more precisely of German and French-speaking Swiss internet users. And there we want to just first measure the frequency of exposure to hate speech in a self-identified definition of hate speech. And we want to do this more objectively, so not from never to very often, but from several times a day to once a month or less than once a month. Then we will also inquire the location of exposure. Is this specific websites or platforms or messenger apps, for example? And then the frequency of exposure to specific types of hate speech. Here we have these legally relevant ones: insult, defamation, or threat, and then just mere incivility, which does not fall into these legal categories, but is rather in this third type of hate speech where, for example, counter speech would be a good measure, and also aimed at different specific targets. And then what we also want to do in this survey is show the people specific example statements and ask them how much they consider this statement to be hate speech and how much they think that the sender should be punished. And we will gather sociodemographic information and then in a quasi-experimental approach test the 2 hypotheses. Now I'll show you a bit better how we imagine this. So we have gathered some example statements for insult, defamation, threat, or incivility. And then we would randomly insert specific groups in the brackets that you can see here. And then, of course, also measure those information from the participants so that we can see if someone who is, for example, politically left, considers a statement as more problematic when it's targeting the left, as when it's targeting, I don't know, Muslims or gays or foreigners or a different group that they don't identify with. So this is the first approach. Then second approach is we want to do an experience sampling study, or as Lucas Otto and colleagues have called it, a mobile longitudinal linkage analysis, or MILA. And for that, we would want to recruit a subgroup of participants from this representative survey that have indicated that they are quite often exposed to hate speech. And then we will ask these participants to collect all instances of hate speech that they see for a period of a month, for example. And we will provide them with an app, or actually the market research company has an app where participants can then upload photos or screenshots of all these instances that they see. And each time they upload something, we will just ask them very few questions about it, where it was, and how they feel about it. And then we will analyze all this content that is gathered through this method to determine the nature of hate speech or incivility, so that we can compare it with the legal or academic definitions. So with this second work package, we do actually want to see what participants identify as hate speech if we don't show them an example, but if it's really up to themselves, where they encounter it, and then also very relevantly, how well what they said in the survey corresponds to what they deliver after with this method, because we are also not sure how well participants are even able to recall how often they are exposed to hate speech in general and on the different platforms. So we hope to find this or compare this kind of tracked data with the self-reported survey data as well. So at the moment, we are actually working on the questionnaires for both types of surveys, the representative one and the Miller one. Then once these are finished, we will seek ethical approval and probably also have to clarify some legal aspects because we want to include these hate speech examples. So if any of you has experience with showing such content in surveys, we would be grateful for all hints and advices. And then we will develop the codebook for the classification of the Miller content. And with that, I am at the end of the presentation, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments.
Thanks a lot, Dominic, and let me extend what Micah was saying. That it's a pleasure to have you. Really enjoyed reading your work on populism and emotion. It's nice to seeing it extended to new topics with this particular topic. Also nice that you're presenting someone that you still need to do, because now we can still comment on it.
That's what I thought.
With a purpose. I also saw Sina says that she's listening via Zoom, so we can actually give her the more difficult questions.
Yeah, she can take notes for me.
Okay.
If somebody says something there.
And so there are also quite a few people online, 19 participants. So if you have any questions, then you can type them into the Q&A box, and I'll read them out loud here. But let's start in the room. Are there any questions?
Yeah, very interesting project, super nice. I was wondering what kind of emotions you're gonna include, because I don't know, you talked about anger, but I can also imagine, at least in one of my experiments, I also saw that participants can really react sort of, oh, this is ridiculous, instead of being anger, and maybe that has different consequences. So maybe it would be nice to also get different.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think we have not fully clarified this yet. What I also think of is compassion or something like that. It could also be interesting, but then what you referred to, I think, is mostly entertainment, because I think there are also some people who seek like maybe not hate speech, but like controversial comments or offensive comments because they find it entertaining, right? And when people say I'm exposed to hate speech often or very often, maybe it's also because these people enjoy to read through some comment section from the news and then be entertained by that. I don't know. I personally don't find it entertaining, but I know that people do. So yeah, so that's a very good point, I think.
Questions? Bhadesh?
Thanks. Very cool study. I think it will be very interesting. I have a couple or two actually questions. The first one is about the hostile media effect, right? You gave three reasons for that, and I was wondering how about the media themselves? So you focus more on individuals, but how about media themselves? Could it be that that it depends to quite some extent on which medium it is that hate speech is or is not expressed. So for instance, people, if it's on Fox News, then it's different for some people maybe than when it's on CNN, for instance. Yeah. So to what extent do the media themselves play a role? And my second question is, you said that, or your expectation is that individuals are more likely to perceive statements as hate speech if they identify with the target group. But I was wondering, to what extent does it matter to what extent they dislike the sender of the message, so that it's not so much about the target, but more about the sender, and then it doesn't maybe even matter if you identify with the group that is targeted, but just with you feeling negative about the person that is doing the, well, whether it's hate speech or not, but the talking. That's it.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting points. I think related to the first one, there is a bit of research about that shows that people are more likely to perceive comments as hostile when they are under news articles from news media that they don't like, or so I think that goes in that direction, right? I don't know if the propensity that hate speech arises under such comments is, or depending on the news medium, is higher or lower. That would also be interesting, I guess, because we could maybe assume, but I don't know if that's actually true, that maybe higher quality media obtains less hate speech comments under news articles than maybe tabloid media, but I don't even know if this is actually would be true. And then the second thing is, it might be that people also identify comments as hate speech if the sender of the message is someone they dislike. And I think this would be interesting for us in the Miller study, but we can test it in the survey, I think, because there we can't manipulate the sender so well. But yes, it's a good point. We should probably consider this for the code book so that we also ask them if they know the person and if they like the person.
Yeah, because it's also related to your point. Maybe there's, I think many people are also looking, that they want to be morally outraged, basically. And they are really, focusing on the person they themselves hate to some extent, and looking at what this person is saying.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, there's a question from your colleague, Tobias Rohrbach. And he says, really cool. I was wondering whether your work package 2 has room for some qualitative follow-ups, interview, focus group, case studies. Are you looking for a job, Tobias? I think this might be helpful, at least for interpreting and communicating the results, particularly for political people.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think what we now agreed is to just have these people do this and then have a debriefing with them. But I think probably depending on, probably more money that we don't have in this, but maybe, I don't know, depending on how expensive everything turns out to be, I think that would be an interesting approach. For the moment, I think our aim is to try to discover these mechanisms with the questions that we ask them when they upload the content, and then maybe at the end of this whole period have some follow-up questions, but more in a quantitative way, even though it's just a small sample, of course. So it could also be open-ended questions that we then have a look at. But we did not plan to extend this any further, but yes, it would be interesting, and you have time, Tobias. You're welcome to join.
There's a question from Christian online.
Hi, Dominique. My question goes in the same direction as Matthias' second question. For your quasi-experimental setup, I was wondering, the groups you're varying here. What? What?
Okay, Christian, we can't hear you.
Oh, that's interesting.
Oh, it's in our settings.
Amsterdam is not working. I heard you perfectly fine, Christian.
I don't know what.
I think you don't have the microphone. The wrong.
Maybe you have to your speakers on silent, guys.
Yeah.
Because you have to sound on.
I apologize. Christian, can
you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
No, I still don't hear you. Oh wait, but it's.
I can submit my.
Yes, it worked.
Yeah. All right. Perfect. I was just saying I can also submit it via the Q&A box. What I just wanted to ask, which it goes in a similar direction as Matthias' second question, is in your quasi-experimental setup, the groups that you randomize who are the target of the hate speech. Is the reason why you only include people from the same camp, more or less, like minorities and people on the left who is sympathetic toward minorities? why not also include conservatives there so you can see how that works across political lines?
Yeah, thank you. Very good question. This was actually not the final selection of groups that we showed. We are also not sure yet which groups we want to include and how many groups we want to include. I think these groups that we saw here on the slides are the ones that work quite easily with these strange allegations that we made there. Because we also thought there is a very recent study for Switzerland that shows that actually most people are experience hate speech based on their bodily appearance. So we were wondering if we can also include something like that, but then it's very strange to say, like, I don't know, overweight people or fat people are known to use child pornography or something. That it sounds very unbelievable, and it becomes even more unbelievable if we say everyone knows that women or men do this. So we thought, like, these statements that we had there, they work quite well with a certain number of groups. And then for other groups, maybe we need to come up with other statements because yeah, not all statements seem to correspond well with all of the groups, but we are still working on this. And I think it's what you said is a good point. We might want to include always like both sides of the medal in some way, and because then at least everyone has a chance to be the target or not the target.
Chance to be slow. There's another question online from Vladimir Boyarskich. Thank you for your presentation. Very interesting project. I was wondering, what kinds of groups are you assessing in the quasi-experiment? On slide 12, it's very specific. Yeah. You showed us examples that seem ideologically close to progressives. Did you consider including groups close to conservatives? For example, the right, the rich, the military?
Yeah, so I think that's basically the same question again. So yes, we are not at a stage where we know which groups we're including, but yes, I think the more you say this, or the more of you say this, it makes sense to always have like both sides of those groups, probably. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, you go. I was just wondering, in your questionnaire, whether you're also thinking of like directly examining the mechanisms you mentioned in relation to hostile media effect. Like, for example, if this target group thinks this is more likely to be, I feel like this is more hostile than the non-target group, whether it is because of the differential recall or because they are more sympathetic to this group and finding this more moderate position extreme and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would be very interesting. I think it would be too much for this representative survey because it cannot be too long and there needs to be quite a bit of information in there anyways. But yes, it would be very interesting. I find it also particularly interesting because, of course, a short comment that is mostly hate speech works a bit different than a longer media report, right? So this selective recall, for example, would be very interesting to see if people even recall short messages differently based on their identification with a group or not. And actually all of these points, right? We don't actually know how well this transfers to shorter contexts. So I think this would be very interesting to do in an experiment actually, but maybe not in this larger survey study, because there we just have a very limited space. But yeah, very good thought, thank you.
Yeah, and the second question I was gonna ask is, you mentioned like if something's considered humorous, it's not considered hate speech, at least like legally.
Mm-hmm.
I was like a little bit confused by that. What is considered humorous, especially who finds it funny? Yeah, so I wanted to hear a little more.
Yeah, that's very difficult. I think this is a question that no one can answer that straightforwardly. I think it's just when it's obvious that it's humor, for example, when it's a satire account or something, I think then it would be protected under this, this was humor or satire and freedom of expression and freedom of art. But when you say it or write it and then say, yeah, but I thought this was funny, then it's probably, but I'm not a legal expert, but then it would probably not be considered as humor and still be hate speech. But I think that the problem is that some accounts that are satirical accounts are not known by everyone. So that's why it's very difficult to assess where these boundaries are. And I think that makes it challenging also for the legal practice to decide what is hate speech or not.
Yeah, thanks. I also think this is super interesting, and I could imagine that perceptions really differ, not just based on identification with the group, but also maybe, yeah, what your network looks like and on what platforms you are. I was wondering if you know something about a more moral element. So you said you also consider, or you talked about how people who perceive something as hate speech also want punishment for the sender of that. So very moral judgment. But I'm wondering, do all people perceive hate speech as a big moral issue? Or are there also people who think that they perceive something as being hostile or hate speech, but they think it's justified? And is there differences between these people? I think that's also a very interesting question. You know, does that correlate a lot? Does everybody think something is hostile also thinks it's unjustified, or can it be also different?
That's a very good point. I think what we thought about is that when you identify with the target and therefore perceive a statement as hate speech, you will also expect that the sender is punished because it affects you personally or your social identity. But of course, it might be that people also perceive something as hate speech but still say, but I would probably say then you would maybe say it is offensive, but probably you would not use the label hate speech when you think it is actually okay. And I think this can mainly happen, as I tried to explain, with very stereotypical attributes for groups that we are used to so well that we tolerate them or think they are kind of adequate, or people should not be offended if they are seen as X, Y, Z. But then I think people would also say it's not so bad. So people would probably not say, yes, this is hate speech, because as soon as you label something as hate speech, it has, at least for me, the implication of this is something that is not okay. And when you think, yeah, this is probably offensive, but this is not hate speech, so people should not make an issue about it, then I think that's what I would expect as a difference here.
But then wouldn't it also be interesting in the second study maybe to let people post screenshots of what they think maybe the masses would perceive to be hate speech and let them explain why they would consider it not to be hate speech? Because I think it's really, really interesting how this justification point may play into it. I mean, maybe not as, I don't know the Swiss context that well. Maybe I could imagine that in very strongly polarized countries, for example.
It's probably more. Yeah, but I think that's a good point. We might not do this with this sample of people who say that they are often confronted with hate speech, because there we would also assume that maybe they overestimate how much hate speech they see, or they understand very different things under hate speech. And I think that's the focus of this second project. But we could also think of recruiting another group or just a normal group of people. Actually, then it does not very much depend how often they think they are exposed to hate speech, but just let people send in examples of things they consider hate speech and of things they don't consider hate speech. That would be a very nice project, I think. Yes. Yeah.
Christian, did you have another question?
Yes, I do have. I was just wondering if you indeed find that the perception of hate speech differs from the formal definition of hate speech. What does it imply then in the bigger picture? What consequences should we draw from them?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I don't think I have a good answer for that. But I think then it could at least explain. First of all, it could explain why people increasingly report being exposed to hate speech, although there are actually quite a lot of efforts to minimize hate speech on platforms. And then, of course, we would need to assess or actually, I think to answer the question, we need to know what kind of content they perceive as hate speech. Because if it's, let's say, very minor offensive statements, but just because people are emotionally involved and they think this is hate speech and it should be prosecuted, then of course we have to say, no, this is not, because there is freedom of expression, for example. But if these are, probably these are also things where we see that just the classifiers do not work well enough and should be expanded in a certain direction, then that would of course be a nicer finding, so that we could actually do something to optimize, for example, automated detection of hate speech.
Yeah, thanks, Dominique. Sorry I couldn't be there in person in Amsterdam. Super interesting project. As a quick suggestion and a question, the suggestion is for the sort of avoidance of just focusing on one ideological group. I think Mark Brandt and Jared Crawford have done in psychology some really good work on sort of intolerance and seeing how that depends just on the target group. So you might get some inspiration from their work. And then question is, I don't know much about this, but is hate speech, is it only hate speech when it's expressed in person? And the follow-up question is, do you consider the messages people get in their, say, direct messages, Facebook requests? If I see, I have a sense, but this is just a me search based on what I read and hear, is that there's a lot of these sort of threats and insults, actually not always public, but also in your like direct messages or your Facebook Messenger. And are you taking that into account, or is that not hate speech?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the suggestion. We will definitely look into this. And thank you also for the question. I'm not sure what you meant with the in-person aspect. So let me first answer the second part of your question. Yes, I would say that if it's in a more private communication channel, it is still hate speech. And I think that's also how the legal definition would see it. And when people get these messages, for example, on WhatsApp or I don't know, they can also upload them in the study, of course. And maybe you can explain once more.
That was actually, maybe I just phrased it wrong. That was more or less my question is okay, that still hate speech? And do you consider that? I was just wondering if hate speech needs to be public or if it can also just be directed to people.
Yeah, it can also be directed. It doesn't need to be public, but I would assume that people are more likely probably to perceive a statement as hate speech when it is public or when it can reach a large public, also due to the perceived influence that this statement might have on other groups. But this is actually an aspect that we are not research or that we did not really consider now for this project. But we would definitely be open for it or consider all forms of also interpersonal communication as a source for hate speech.
Just sort of picking up what Lina said, it would be kind of cool to learn people what hate speech is, sort of as a sort of an experimental. Because to be honest, before hearing your definitions, I had some sort of layman idea, but I'm not sure if that was legally correct. So if you would sort of teach half your people what hate speech is and the other half not, if you then see more reporting or less, that would be really interesting.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Also, because we were quite a bit unsure how much we should tell them in the beginning of the survey about what hate speech is. Our perspective is not much in order to see what would they report. But then the person actually responsible at the Ofcom was like, yeah, but maybe we should inform the people more about what hate speech is. And we were like, no, maybe not. And I think, it would also be a cool idea to do it with some and not do it with others.
I would make it an experiment and see if that, because
affects.
And do it within and between.
Some you tell later. Or
so with the Milla, if you follow people over time, you can tell them one group halfway.
That's a good idea.
This is the definition. What you've been telling us so far is nice. Might think about it.
No, but also because it could be an identity, right? It could be like who knows, right? Maybe all sorts of misperceptions.
A hate speech reporter.
Yeah, very good point. Thank you.
And there's also a question from Luca Verstegen. He thinks it's a cool project. And he says, people constantly talk about polarization and online hate. When asked in a survey if you experience hate speech, it's almost weird to say you never experience it. So will people experience more hate speech when being asked about it?
That's a good question. I don't know if it's like, I think what you imply is that it's kind of socially desirable to be exposed to hate speech, and I'm not sure if this is really the case. So if people really think they're missing out on something, if they report that they're not confronted with hate speech. So I'm not sure if I would also assume that many studies that have measured frequencies of exposure with hate speech overestimate the phenomenon, but not because people like to report that they are confronted with hate speech, but because people, as we just also saw, most people have a very vague idea what hate speech is. And if you're asked if you have seen that, and you probably say yes, and probably you say even yes without really thinking of a specific instance where you saw that, but you think just yes, I think this is quite a prevalent phenomenon. So yes, maybe I have seen it. But I don't think that there is a tendency to over-report, because it would, I think this is with, for example, of course, we know that people over-report how often they read the news, or I don't know, things like that, because they think it's cool. But I don't think this is the case with hate speech, or I don't hope, at least.
If I may give you one suggestion there, you might say that in certain cultural groups, it is socially desirable to be able to identify hate speech as part of an identity to pick out those people crossing boundaries. Oh, I see lots of questions. I'll shut up. You go first.
Thank you for your talk. It was really interesting. Just one thing, like, if I got a survey question and it said, like, have you ever experienced hate speech? Is it supposed to be like this was directed at me, or is it like, have I seen it? It sounded like maybe it'll be in French and German, so maybe you won't use a different word. But that might be a little bit confusing, because it kind of suggests that it's like directed at me personally.
Yeah, we will have a question that actually the wording is more like, have you been exposed to hate speech, in the sense of have you seen hate speech on the internet? And then we will also ask people how often they have been the target. And also we will also ask them if they have posted hate speech themselves or sent hate speech themselves. Although we know that probably their social desirability will be high and people will not say it. But actually there's a sociologist who has conducted a study in Switzerland last year on that topic. She was specifically investigating which groups are often victims of hate speech, and also which groups are more likely to engage in hate speech themselves. And she has actually formulated a quite good item to measure the own participation, to make it a bit easier for people to say they do also or did already post hate speech comments. She asked, like, the options were not just yes and no, but also yes, but I have been offended before, or yes, but so some other statements. So we will also consider this. Yes.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on what we said before. I lost my train of thought.
There's not a question online. I can.
Yeah, go with the answer.
There was also one in the.
Oh yeah.
My question about the language. Right now, two different languages, and I'm assuming that French-speaking people will be exposed much more to French-speaking media, and German-speaking one to much more. And could be play a role in the perception of the hate speech, because in the French context, maybe those kind of things, not that people think that offensive, not much the hate speech, because of the much more free speech or freedom of the speech. And in the German context could be different.
Yeah, this could be the case. We don't have any specific expectation if it would be more or less in one language region, but this is actually an interesting question, and the data will definitely show also if probably different groups are more susceptible or different forms of hate speech are more prevalent on one side or the other. I don't think, I'm not sure if there's a justified assumption for postulating any differences, but it definitely could be, yes. We just try to keep the examples the same, so they will just be professionally translated from, like we make the German examples and then they will be translated to French. But of course, it could be that things differ, yes.
Vladimir Boyarsky has a suggestion to also look into the severity of the statements in addition to who's targeted and who sends it. And he sends two research articles with that question.
Oh, nice.
So I'll forward it to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I can just quickly say that we also think that actually this legal taxonomy that we also included here in the examples. So we think, of course, like these threat and incitement for violence are probably the most severe statements. Then defamation and insult is more like, this is legally relevant, but probably not that severe, and maybe does also, we are still trying to figure out together with the Ofcom if insult and defamation actually fall under criminal law in Switzerland or if they fall under the administrative law. And in my view, it's probably more at this, and that this threat and incitement of violence is probably that what falls under criminal law. And then the mere incivility is, of course, the least problematic one, and that also cannot be legally prosecuted. But we are not the experts on these legal aspects, so we still try to figure this out. But of course, yes, I would say it makes a difference, and maybe the interesting variations will be with the more actually with the incivility statements and not the ones that are legally considered hate speech. And I think this is also where these gaps then can arise between what is classified as hate speech also by automated detection and what people perceive as hate speech and continue to see on the internet.
Last question.
But have you found your?
I have found it.
There you go.
Just a brief, because it was about the comment of the social desirability. I think it's more maybe that people will be primed a little bit more and see more, because I feel like if I encounter something on Twitter, I will recognize it as hate speech actively. But then if I'm asked to find something that maybe I will also perceive more anonymous comments on platforms such as YouTube or Reddit, where I usually would consider these people just trolls or whatever, because it's so anonymous and there's not really a person behind that to me, that maybe that becomes more, well, people perceive it to be more prevalent than when they are primed to look for these statements.
I think the aspect that you said is also a good point to maybe include in the Miller study, if they perceive that it is actually directed towards someone or not, right? Yeah.
Well, you
Very
can
brief. I will be very brief. It's about the definition. Does hate speech, does it have to be speech? So
you mean it can also be pictures?
Yeah.
Yes. There is another project actually that was financed by this Ofcom called They Look at Pictures. And this is Franziska Ume and Stefano Pedrazzi, and they will do that.
We have a very recent example in the Netherlands that I can, we had a picture, there was a picture of two ministers with a flag, and then there was a member of parliament from a far right party, and he photoshopped the Nazi flag in there. If I think about it, because they're going to do a data donation study, so if I think about it, I'll forward you the link so you can upload it there.
Great. All right, we're running out of time. So I want to thank you, Dominique, and I actually did not forget this time to bring you the coffee.
Yeah, thank you.
And that leaves me a little bit of time to announce the remainder of our program. So next week, we have Teresa Capellos from University of Birmingham to give a talk, and the title is Anger Issues, a political psychology analysis of ressentiment and grievance politics. Then we have a minor break of 2 weeks due to the holiday and the Hot Politics Lab retreats. And then we convene again on November 4th with Flavio Acevedo. For those people on campus, that talk will be elsewhere. I didn't remember which room, but it's somewhere in one of these teaching rooms below us. Flavio will talk about measuring ideology, current practices, consequences, recommendations. And the week after, Jochem Tolsma from Radboud University will talk about political polarization and residential segregation. Then we'll have Frank Gonzalez from Arizona giving a talk on inhibition or ideology, the neural mechanism of racial priming in politics. And then we end the month of November with Graduate Friday with Christine People and Maaike Homan giving a presentation on their projects. Then I think there is one more meeting this year. I'm very quickly going to the schedule. Oh, no, yeah, one more meeting this year. That's December 2nd. Kristen Schultz from the, it was announced as from the University of Arizona on our website, but she's from the University of Amsterdam, from the Amsterdam School of Communication. And her talk is Neural Mechanisms of Polarization and Information Spread. It does sound a lot like Frank's talk, but different university will fix that. I'm sorry. There's one more thing I need to do. What we also always forget is thanking our sponsors. So the European Research Council and the Politics and Life Sciences Association who made these beautiful mugs. You can also actually get this one if you want to.
Yeah,
Think about it.
Yeah.
Think about it. This is our American mug and it's our European mug.
Yeah, I think I'll stick with the European.
And of course, the University of Amsterdam, the Dutch National Science Foundation, and WO, and probably a lot of other people that we forget. And I want to thank you all for joining us here today. It's been a real pleasure. For those of you who are physically in the room, maybe a small beer or something else. Let's see. See you next week.